Chief Executives, broadcasting live from the SFU Beedie School of Business on CKNW.
And thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I want to find out about Global Relay at some point in the hour. But the purpose of this series really has been to find out about the people who create businesses, people who develop leadership skills and lead groups of people. So let me just ask you, first of all, what was your first job?
My first job?
Yeah.
I think I'd describe myself as a lifelong entrepreneur. So my first job was running a business. When I think back, I mean that was a long time ago, Bill. But when I think back, as a kid growing up, I just like building things. You can map that right back to Lego. And what was exciting for me was sort of my dream as a kid, which was to build houses. And I spent a lot of time in high school out at construction sites. And I mean, let's face it, you're a 14 to 18-year-old poking around a construction site, waiting for someone to pay attention to you and come out and show you what they were doing. And I just found that whole industry, so exciting that was really the choice that I made, was to start a building company to design and build homes, quite young, which I did between 83 and 89.
How old were you?
I would have started when I was about 20.
Okay, you went to school?
I finished high school, and when I looked at options for me, university seemed to be going in one direction, and I seemed to be going in another, and I just couldn't reconcile the two. So I really went off on my own, because for me, I learn in a certain way, and I knew that a formal education wasn't really a good fit, or at least it didn't seem like a good fit at the time.
And didn't seem to be necessary.
I mean, that's again, at the time, you're absolutely right, in my view. I mean, I think some of the things that you pick up in school outside of a formal education are really important, the social side. Because if you start a business when you're 20, as a lot of entrepreneurs do, you do lack a certain amount of maturity that just comes with age. So you go through a huge learning curve. I don't think you can say, one form of an education is necessarily any better or worse than another. That was just what I chose because it suited my personality.
The reason I mention it is Jim Treliving was a guest on the show, the fellow who now owns Boston Pizza. He started by buying one with a partner. And I asked him about that, and he said, well, I didn't go to university, I didn't go to business school, but I've told my kids I'm paying for their education wherever they choose to go, and if they are successful, if they graduate, I'll pay their way home.
I think everybody would agree with that. I mean, it's an opportunity you shouldn't miss out on, especially today, because we're living in a complicated world, and having a fundamental education is, I think, really important to a good future.
Did you have what we would call a mentor?
I've never had a mentor, but I've taken the opportunity to learn from everybody. In our business, we service a lot of sophisticated companies, and I've kind of distilled my pitch, my learning pitch down to a very simple phrase: what do you do? How do you make money? And the explanation that comes back from entrepreneurs that are out running, hedge funds and broker dealers are really quite amazing, because that's, in my opinion anyway, the best question you can ask anybody.
You started off building houses. How did you go from building houses to Global Relay?
It's a good question. You'd think there wouldn't be a relationship, but between, and this was back in Ontario, so between 83 and 89, it was really a focus solely on building. And you obviously learn a lot. You learn a lot about people. You learn a lot about business. In 89, Ontario had quite a significant recession, and we just got to the point in our business where we couldn't make ends meet. And what that really means is there was a huge amount of lessons learned. So ultimately, I moved to BC in 1990 to start over. Your classic entrepreneur in debt up to your eyeballs, knowing somehow you're going to dig it out of the hole and make it happen. And what I really looked at was, because you have some time to think when you're transitioning points in your life. So I took the time to think. And what I saw was the whole architecture, engineering, construction world going from paper-based drawings to CAD systems. So what I did was went out and borrowed money to buy, I think at the time it was about a $10,000 computer with AutoCAD, and I literally learned computer CAD design and worked for a few of the local architects in Vancouver who were really supportive of me in doing that, because they knew that I could leverage my construction background and marry it to the technology that they needed to produce drawings, for the construction business.
And what is CAD?
CAD's computer-aided design. So effectively, where a traditional architect or engineer would draw on paper, you would have a computer substitute that. So a very different skill set in that industry. And from 1990 to 1997, that was what I solely focused on, producing drawings for about 2.5 million square feet of projects in Vancouver proper, which is a lot of projects. And again, you learn a lot going through that.
Talking with Warren Roy, the Chief Executive of Global Relay, and we'll come back and learn much more from him. We also have a live audience here at the Beedie School of Business, and we're going to encourage them to be involved as well, asking questions, and we'll be back with much more right after this. Talking with Warren Roy, the CEO of Global Relay, and I want to talk a little bit about you and how you got to where you are today, but I think it's important for people listening to have a better understanding of what Global Relay really is. I mean, if I'm talking Starbucks, people know what it is. If it's Lululemon, they know what it is. Global Relay is kind of, well, what is that?
So fundamentally, we archive electronic messaging for the financial sector. So if you're a broker-dealer, investment advisor, hedge fund, or bank, you have rules that are put in place by the country that you operate in. So in the United States, it's the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Most people are familiar with the SEC. In Canada, it's something called IROC. In England, the FSA, so the Financial Services Authority. So every country has a regulator that has rules that mandates financial organizations to archive all electronic correspondence. So people think of that as email, but it's really all forms of communication that go in and out of a business. So email, Bloomberg messaging, Reuters messaging, text messaging off your mobile phones, everything to do with their trading systems, effectively how they communicate and conduct business. All that data is pulled in by Global Relay through various feeds and stored typically for 5 to 7 years in our data centers in Vancouver.
So I'm sitting here thinking, here's this kid who went out and looked at construction sites and wanted to figure out how things worked, and built a construction business that ran into tough times during a recession, and you wind up heading a worldwide company that looks after the financial affairs of banks all around the world. It seems a remarkable story. When you look back at your own life, what skill set do you have? What is it that makes you tick, that has made you make these leaps and bounds?
Skill set. There was no grand plan to get here. That I will absolutely tell you. It's more a case of taking advantage of what you see unfolding in front of you, which is brought to light by asking questions and thinking through circumstances that you're in. So if I step back to the design business and creating CAD, well, if you do that for a decade, you create a lot of drawings. And the interesting aspect to it is that when you look at any big project, you have mechanical, electrical, structural, civil engineers all creating a lot of drawings. Well, try managing them. So Global Relay itself was originally created to manage data for the construction world, where we wanted to preserve who said what when. So that's why we built the company. 4 years after building it, we had a really hard time deriving, effectively convincing architects and engineers to give us their data, because they didn't want to do that. They wanted to control it themselves. Coinciding with that, Arthur Andersen, WorldCom, Enron all blow up in America. The U.S. comes down with these regulatory rules. We look at the financial sector, and despite knowing nothing about it, we just realized we had the perfect service. We just had to change industries. So that's how we ended up in finance. And to be totally frank, at the time, we didn't know what a hedge fund was, and there was only 4 employees in the business. So you go through a huge education, and the upside to finance is that when they need you, they will help you. So they really provide you with the education on their businesses, their relationships, and the regulatory environment that they live within. So that's where the education comes from. And as long as you're willing to ask the question, the answers will come back. That presents the opportunity.
So you had 4 employees?
Yes.
How many do you have now?
235.
All around the world?
The majority of them are in Vancouver, but we also have offices in Chicago, New York, London, and Singapore. So there's probably about 25 people outside of the country.
Those inside are outside. Who are you looking for? What kind of people do you want?
It really depends on the role. So if you look at a technology business, you have a great deal of roles. You have the sales teams, you have the product management teams, the project management teams, you have the software development groups, you have the QA teams that do quality control. You have the audit side, the security side. So you really have a cross of personalities and capability that literally include almost everybody in society. And in our business, because we chose to also design and build our own data centers, you pick up again the whole construction industry. So in terms of who we're looking for, it's people that absolutely have integrity because of the nature of what we do. You have to keep in mind that on an average business day, we will produce data for between 15 and 20 audits or subpoenas that roll in our door, where our customers have to hand data over to the regulators or the courts. So the very nature of that makes it very serious. So we need people that are good at public-facing roles, dealing with the customer, good at developing technology that doesn't fail. Obviously, you can't have problems with the operational systems. And people that are really willing to put in the extra mile to allow us to achieve our goals competitively. Because at the end of the day, we're quite a small organization, but we compete against Microsoft, against CA Symantec. They're all, $8 to $15 billion organizations. So we've really focused in the financial sector, and we hope to attract people that just have the passion for competing, and certainly the skill set to take on any of the roles that we have internally.
Do you think, in terms of trying to create a culture, is there a culture that Global Relay has that helps you retain people?
I mean, culture is something that we really work on, and as a management team, we talk about it all the time. Sometimes conveying the message down to the staff is a little more tricky. So for us, when I look at the business today, I think it's a business where there's enormous friendship, which I think is quite unusual for any organization, and it's friendships that are built over recognizing the accountability and responsibility that the teams have. And I know when I look at it, the majority of Global Relay employees would have the majority of their friends within the company. So I always notice at the end of the day, it's teams of people that go off and play, field hockey, floor hockey, whatever it may be, and it really is quite incredible to watch that happen. But it does develop under a framework where management absolutely cares about the employees, and I think, one of the common misconceptions in business is what's really important, and for us, when we look at the stakeholders of our organization, most people look at the key stakeholder being the owner, who literally has the shares in the business.
That would be you.
That would be a team within the business. So yes, I'm a shareholder, absolutely, and so I would own about half the business. The balance of the business is owned by the employees and a few friends and family, which is how we initially raised money. And when we look at how we value people, the biggest stakeholder in the business is the employee, and the single most important thing, because without them, you won't achieve your goals. The second biggest stakeholder is the customer, and everybody has to recognize that. The third is management, and the last is the shareholder. So looking at business from that perspective, I think is the healthiest thing for the shareholder, despite the fact that you put them last in the priorities and decision making.
How old would your average employee be?
They vary a lot. The average employee is probably 25. So we would have a spectrum between their 20s right up to the 50s. So most of our senior management team, which would comprise about a dozen people, would be in their early 40s. And then it starts getting quite a bit younger after that.
Warren Roy will talk much more when we come back after the news headlines next. And I'm Bill Good with Warren Roy, the CEO of Global Relay. We're at the Beedie School of Business at Simon Fraser University's downtown campus. This is the first in a new round of our Chief Executive Series, and I'm going to ask a gentleman at the microphone here live this morning to ask a question of Warren.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, my name's Matt Henderson. I'm a business development executive with a global accounting firm. And so, Warren, I certainly understand what you're talking about when you speak about what happened with Sarbanes-Oxley and Enron and Anderson about 10 years ago and the compliance opportunity that it represented. And given my background in business development, I'd be curious to know how you went from, in the construction industry, as a very small firm, to the financial industry and grew your business, given I'm assuming you didn't have any relationships, you didn't know anything about the industry. Was it a question of cold calling? Was it a question of emails, websites? Was it a combination thereof? How did you develop your business in the financial services sector?
Sure, that's a great question. There was a number of things that unfolded at the same time. When the rules first came down from the SEC, requiring the financial sector to archive their data, we made a phone call to the regulator, spoke with, so at the time it was the NASD, the National Association of Securities Dealers, and we spoke to a very senior person by the name of Mark Volz that was responsible for oversight for the broker-dealers. And we literally said, hi Mark, we're a small Vancouver technology company, 4 employees. We developed fundamental technology for archiving, and we think it applies to the financial sector. Would you be willing to help us out? And that might seem like an odd call, to a regulator, but he ended up being just an exceptional individual who I still know today. And he really walked us through what the rules meant. And it fell into 2 categories. Supervision, which requires flagging of information as it comes into our archive. That was a component we didn't have. So he helped us understand what it would look like. And we spent about 6 months developing it. And the other side of it was really helping explain the industry, who the regulator was, what the roles were, why they needed vendors like Global Relay. Because at the time, there wasn't really any competition. It was what's classically called, green field. So we ended up putting, I have to think back to this, we ended up putting an ad on Google, and I think we paid 25 cents a click at the time for NASD archiving. And the calls just came piling in the door because people actually needed it because they were being mandated to do it. We were getting reasonable guidance from the regulator on how to develop our service. And we began to work with very small broker-dealers. These were typically 10-person firms, 15-person firms, and integrating our technology to meet their needs. Those organizations will also equally take the time to explain their businesses exactly what the technology, in their opinion, should do. So it really is, multiple things that were going on at the same time. And interestingly enough for us, employee number 4 was Shannon Rogers. And Shannon came from McCarthy's and BLG as a lawyer and took on the role of general counsel. So that put us in a position where we had an individual that had a sufficient level of sophistication that we could deal with large organizations. So it wasn't very long before large organizations began to call. And one of our, big early wins was the Chicago Stock Exchange, just as an example. And ultimately we went down to see them, explained our technology, and they do recognize, all these organizations recognize that you're a very small technology provider, and they are a very large business by comparison. So it's a bit of a gamble for them always. So they're really just looking at you as individuals and saying to themselves, can we trust these guys to continue to develop their service to meet our needs? Keeping in mind, they didn't have a lot of options. So they really took made that bet on us, and we worked with one firm after another and slowly built the business.
It's a remarkable story, and we'll be back with more right after this. Warren Roy, CEO of Global Relay, and it was interesting. The audience was, of course, listening to breaking news, and one of the people here said there should be an opportunity for you, perhaps keeping care of some of government business.
Yeah, it's a great point. So in our organization, we always focused on the U.S. markets and the financial sector. But we've certainly noticed in the last year there's a lot of activity in government, both federal and provincial, and we've started to look at that in terms of the whole process around, well, one, how do you deal with the government? Because it is absolutely enormous. We're used to dealing with financial firms that put decision makers at a boardroom table and can come to decisions very quickly. The federal government, as I have been recently educated on, is not an easy organization to understand nor deal with. So we certainly are making efforts in it. We hope to do well at some point. And obviously for us, we'd love to see the Canadian government and the provincial governments use Canadian technology, because today it's all American. And when you think about the amount of jobs that are generated in America, providing Canadian or U.S. technology to the Canadian governments, it would be nice if we just shifted that across the border.
I want to find out a little bit more about you. Give me a day in the life of Warren Roy.
Keeping in mind that we run a true 24/7 business. In other words, messaging never stops flowing, and we have customers operating literally 5.5 days a week, if you take the time zone shift into consideration. My day begins at 7 with a morning call to our London office, where we look at our business strategy on what we're focused on there. So in London, it's global banking and what's called interdealer brokers. So a broker that connects trades between two banks. The UK really owns the interdealer broker market. So there's 7 major what we call IDBs that reside there. So I deal a little bit with the business strategy and a little bit with operations. From there it moves to New York. So you're really just following the sun. When New York comes online, it's a similar thing. We'll do an operational review and we'll look at business opportunities from the standpoint of how I can add value to the sales process. So I spend about half my time on the road. I just got back from Chicago and New York, and on Saturday I'm off to the UK to really spend the next 2 months in London and Paris, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then home. So a typical day in my life is not typical. When Vancouver comes live, my efforts really are focused on working on the weak links of the business. What's preventing us from growing? In terms of a typical day, it's scheduled for me by an admin team that will slot about 80% of my time. If I can find an hour of freedom, I cherish it, and I will sit down with senior managers and review what their strategies are and try to assist in that area.
That's an hour of freedom. I was thinking, do you go for a run? Do you play golf? Do you go out for lunch? Do you have a date? What?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's that side of it. So we do live in rainy Vancouver, so I try to travel as much as I can in the wintertime, and I try to spend as much of the summertime as I can here. So the most likely spot to find me would be on the North Shore in the Lynn Valley, where I'll often go on hikes with our team. We conduct business interviews, with people that we're trying to bring in, because there's nothing better than getting out into the woods, in my opinion, and having a discussion with either existing employees or prospects. So I've learned to combine a bit of exercise while still being able to conduct business.
And your employees like that?
They actually love it, because if you take, 6-8 guys up into the woods, you learn a lot about them. You probably learn more about them in an hour of that than you would working with them for 4 or 6 months. And again, Vancouver being what it is, there is a good work-life balance for most people. There's a lot of people that love the outdoors, whatever it may be. And obviously I, like to spend some time doing things that might be more fun. I do a bit of skiing, a bit of sailing, those sorts of things. But Global Relay is really, an all-encompassing life experience. And it just seems like, if you want to grow the business, which is our commitment, it takes a huge amount of effort.
Do you want to grow it to sell it, or do you want to grow it just to grow it?
We have no plans to sell it. I've mentioned to people many times, we're asked on a daily basis if the company's for sale. We actually have offers at the rate of about 2 to 3 a week to sell it, to fund it, to leverage it, to do a variety of things with it. Keeping in mind that our customers are the financial sector firms that buy companies professionally. So there's a relationship there, and I have to spend a lot of time talking to them about, what we're going to do with Global Relay, because they look at it as an opportunity. But for us, what really is important to us, is building a successful technology business in Vancouver, employing as many people as we can in good jobs, and building a success story. It was really upsetting to me and to a lot of people when Canada lost Nortel, because you look at it and you just think, how could such an incredible business vanish? A business that employed 100,000 people. It just seems unconscionable, but it happened. And when you look at what the typical state of mind is in technology in Vancouver, it's about starting a business based on an idea, growing it, possibly not even to a commercial level, but just to a point that it functions, and then selling it to an American firm. So that's how a lot of people define success. I don't look at that as success. I look at it as a lost opportunity. And when you look at how much you can add, certainly to our city and our province in terms of running a technology business here and growing it here, the value is just huge. And when I look at just Global Relay and what it does, we pull about $30 million a year across the border. That goes into about 235 jobs ultimately. From that revenue, you pay $7 million to the federal government in taxes. You pull it out from the federal government in terms of some shred, which helps our research and development. So we take those funds and we hire more developers to build more technology. And for us, when you look at the value that a business like ours adds to the community, it's just absolutely huge. So why would you want to sell it to a foreign company?
When we come back, you have been warned. The Vanity Fair questions. Warren Roy. A few minutes with Warren Roy, the Chief Executive Officer of Global Relay, and I promised you some Vanity Fair type questions. You take time to read?
I do.
What do you read?
So really for me, where I find my interest is in the newspaper. So number one newspaper, Financial Times in the UK, because it has a very balanced view of the world. In other words, it's not it's not biased, as a lot of US newspapers are. So I read that every day because it applies to our industry. It explains, the financial world.
Do you read it online, or do you actually have a paper?
I read it online. However, when I can get a paper, I love it. But generally speaking, I read it online.
If you could have dinner with any 4 people, living or dead, who would they be and why?
So I thought about this because you did give me some warning. And I divided it into 4 categories. And it starts with, so to me, the local hero, right? Because you have to start local. And it would absolutely be Jimmy Pattison. And the reason is that he's been in business for 5, maybe 6 decades, which is incredible. He does a huge amount for the community just in terms of what his operations generate. But what I'm really curious about is, for each decade, when he was in his 30s and his 40s, what was really driving him? So what was he like in his head in his 30s and his 40s? Was he focused, just on the money? Was he focused because he loved the car industry? Like, what were his real passions? And that would be, what I'd love to find out.
And he still keeps a schedule very similar to yours.
I don't know how he does it. It's absolutely remarkable.
Who else?
So number 2 would be in the financial sector, because that's our world, and it would be an individual by the name of Brooksley Born. And Brooksley was the chairman of the CFTC, which is the U.S. regulator of commodities and futures. And there's a reason for it. Many times in your life, you're faced with in just daunting challenges. And in 1999, Brooksley stood in front of the U.S. government and very clearly laid out why the U.S. was going to collapse through derivatives trading. So if you think of the world economy, about $50 trillion. If you look at the derivatives world, about $500 trillion, just to put it into scope. And the banks leveraged derivatives for doing just about everything. I mean, a derivative is like an index. The Dow Jones is an index. So Brooksley was up against Alan Greenspan, at the time, without question, the most powerful man in finance. And she laid out for the government exactly why America was taking on huge risk, exactly what would lead to the financial collapse. And Alan Greenspan sat back and he absolutely put it in her place, discounted everything she had to say, and she ended up ultimately resigning from the CFTC. 6 years later, the U.S. financial system collapses. Greenspan ultimately stepped up to the table to apologize because he couldn't see it coming. She laid out in detail exactly what would unfold, and it did. And I find it remarkable that somebody could step up to the plate, literally in a guy's world, and explain, undaunted, what would unfold, to be totally rebuffed.
I have less than a minute left. Who are the other 2?
The other 2, for me, when you look at the world stage, it would be, without question, Margaret Thatcher, because she had the biggest impact on me growing up, one of the most spectacular leaders the world's ever had. And number 4, on a personal level, comes back to my childhood, would be Jacques Cousteau, because he opened up, the ocean world. He was an incredible storyteller.
Well, speaking of stories, if somebody tried to make up your story, nobody would believe it. But I thank you very much for sharing it with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Bill.
The Chief Executives, broadcasting live from the SFU Beedie School of Business on CKNW.